As I said, we're very pleased to have Andy here. He's going to talk to you, read from his new book, which is a really interesting look at the lives of, or particular moments in the lives of, first Miss Shelley, Lord Byron, Mary Shelley, and Claire. Remember what Claire's last name is? Clement. Anyway, it's a really interesting, they're crazy, fascinating people, and he brings them to life. So, here's Andy. Again, thanks for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, John. Thank you very much. Francis, did you see that Zazi's over there? Okay, all right. Thank you very much. My name's Andy Stott. It's a real pleasure to be here in Talking Leaves. This was when we first arrived in Buffalo, I guess 12 years ago. This was one of the first things we found, and we were delighted to find it. I'm from London and grew up going to independent bookstores, and there's really none in London in the same way that there used to be, rather much like New York City. But here in Buffalo, we have an incredible resource here, and I'm really proud to be reading here. I've never done a book event in Buffalo, even though this is my hometown, and so this is the first, and so this is really great, and I'm very pleased to be here. I've got my eye on you too. So I'm just going to read a few things. I won't take too long. You can ask questions too if you wish, and I'm going to set the context a little bit. But first, I'd like to say thank you to Jonathan for inviting me to come speak, and also I want to say thank you to my family to whom this book is dedicated, especially my long-suffering wife Josie, because when I wrote a book on a depressed comedian, Josie had to listen to me talk about sad clowns every day for 3 years. All right, but who's counting, sweetheart? And then when I wrote a book about a suicidal poet, she had to listen to me talk about suicidal poets every day for 4 years. And so, you know, she's endured a lot, but things should be all right because my next book is on the Black Death, so we're slightly more cheery topic. So on that note, let's begin with a séance. So this is from the end of the book. So Mary Marshall was a stout woman with a strong Cockney accent and the ability to speak with the dead. From her home in Maida Vale, she'd gained a reputation as London's most powerful medium, able to channel spirits by guiding a pencil across an alphabet or rapping on a table that would levitate and glide across her living room floor. She also took in washing. William Rossetti stopped at Mrs. Marshall's on a dark November afternoon in 1865 at the urging of a friend. His attendance there was entirely unplanned, and although the writer was a spiritual agnostic, what happened there gave him pause. A séance was in progress, and when a gentleman at the circle asked if there were any spirits willing to speak with them, the answer was returned, "Uncle John." "I had no uncle of that name," said the man. "Is it my Uncle John?" asked Rossetti. Rossetti had never met the uncle who had died 9 years before he was born, and whom it was forbidden to mention by order of his unsmiling grandfather Gaetano. For him, Uncle John was just a name he'd seen scratched on the fly-leaves of the old books his Aunt Charlotte kept, or as a cameo in biographies of Byron. Even his gravesite was about to disappear as St Pancras churchyard made way for the Midlands Railway, the bones dug up and boxed for reburial at a municipal site overseen by a young architect and aspiring novelist named Thomas Hardy. It came as some surprise, therefore, when the spirit answered, "Yes." "Will you tell me truly how you died?" asked Rossetti. "How? Yes," said the spirit. "How?" said Rossetti. "Killed." "Who killed you?" "I." "There is a celebrated poet with whom you were connected," said Rossetti. "What was his name?" Using the alphabet laid out on the table, Mrs. Marshall twice wrote out the letters B-R-O, and then on a third attempt, Byron. "There was a certain book you wrote," Rossetti said, "attributed to Byron. Can you give me its title?" "Yes," replied the spirit, but the medium failed repeatedly to catch it. Abandoning the attempt, Rossetti asked his uncle, "Are you happy?" 2 hard raps followed, meaning not exactly. So that's a kind of introduction by way of epilogue to the main character of this book, who is a young man called John William Polidori. And John William Polidori was a physician by training and something of a child prodigy. And as a very young man, he attached himself to Lord Byron, who was at that time in 1816 the most famous person certainly in Britain, and probably one of the most famous people in the world after Napoleon, who had recently been defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. Byron had decided to leave Britain in exile because he was he had been accused of adultery, he'd been accused of incest with his half-sister Augusta, he'd been accused of being unpatriotic in his support of Napoleon against the English in the Napoleonic Wars. And he was accused also of cant, essentially being a hypocrite and writing this deeply sentimental poetry while himself being a very caustic and unsympathetic individual. And so Byron, who was prone to sort of dramatic gestures and getting into a high sulk, decided to, as it said, knock the dust of soil of England from his boots and move to the continent. It was basically a big middle finger up to the British to say, I don't need you, you need me more than that. And so he decided to go into exile, ultimately in Venice, which he called the greenest island of my imagination. But on the way, he stopped in Geneva. And during their Swiss sojourn, where Byron went to try and recover some of his health in the company of this young physician, it was a very bad summer. It was very thunderous and rainy. Mount Tambora in Polynesia had exploded the year before and had put an enormous amount of volcanic ash into the upper stratosphere, which blocked sunlight, and as a result meant that it was a very poor summer for crops, constant rain, darkness. And this was the summer sojourn at which Byron met up with another young poet named Percy Bysshe Shelley and his soon-to-be wife, ultimately Mary Shelley, where she came up with the idea for Frankenstein. And so the summer of 1816 is known as this summer of ghost stories and of incredible creativity, and really kind of, one of the defining moments of the Romantic movement. But what I've tried to talk about in my book is the people who are on the fringes of that moment, because we know about Byron, we know about Shelley, and we know about Mary Shelley. What we don't know about so much is some of the other people that constituted members of that party, and two in particular constitute the principal characters that I'm writing about. One was John William Polidori, who went to Geneva in Byron's company and experienced a very bad falling out with Byron that would affect him for the rest of his short life. And another was Mary Shelley's half-sister, a young woman called Claire Clairmont, who briefly became Byron's lover, bore a child by him, and then was rejected by him, and this affected her for her life. And she lived actually into her 90s, but she never really kind of regained the equilibrium she had as an extremely intelligent, very well-educated and talented woman at the age of 18. So she really spent the rest of her life in Byron's shadow. So my book is about what happens at the margins of fame, and really about what you could call the sort of corrosive effects of celebrity. I think of celebrity very much as having this gravitational pull, and people who kind of enter its field find their own personality distorted somewhat, right? We sort of impute to celebrities this kind of extra charisma, this kind of supplementary personality. We give them this kind of enlarged sense of self, which we don't attribute to the non-famous. And when the two come into contact, the famous and the non-famous, very often we'll see that it will have a very deleterious psychological effect on people who kind of come within this sphere of orbit. David, you know all about this, I imagine, not because you're not famous, but because, I should just say, David Schmidt here wrote a book about celebrity, everybody. Okay, footnote there. So this is a book about what happens, right? It's not really a book about Byron, but it is about the sort of shockwave that Byron sent through the lives of these other characters. Without really sort of revealing too much, I'm just going to read a few selections and sort of help piece together the narrative and give you a sense of what these other people were like and the kinds of lives they led prior to their encounter with this Byronic monster. So John William Polidori was the son of an Italian sort of literary jack of all trades called Gaetano Polidori, who had moved from Italy during the French Revolution to set up shop in London. And he basically did translations and all kinds of odd literary jobs. And he married an English woman, and they had an Anglo-Italian family. And in mixed traditions in the early 19th century in Britain, when it came to matters of faith, the girls would follow their mother's sort of religious tradition, and the boys would follow their father's. So John had lots of sisters and lots of brothers. All the girls were Protestants and all the boys were Catholics. And in making this determination, Gaetano Polidori really kind of set his son on a particular trajectory to always be at the margins of British society. There were not equal rights for Catholics and Protestants at this time. Catholics were not allowed to participate in the governmental process to the full extent of the law that Protestants were. And Gaetano didn't want his son going to a Protestant school, so he sent him away to this very, very desolate, very tiny school on the Yorkshire moors called Ampleforth, which still exists and is actually now a very famous school. It's kind of Eton for Anglo-Catholics, and Rupert Everett, you may know him, he is an alumnus of Ampleforth. So, you know, it's a very posh place, but John went there. When John went there was just 7 boys there and about 22 monks. And they lived in this very dark place. It was really like living in the Middle Ages, and they had this very austere life. And then at the age of 15, he went to Edinburgh University to study to become a physician. And that's where I pick up now. So here's John in Edinburgh. It was hard to adapt to student life, and with no mass to anchor his day or prefects to assign him tasks, John found his sudden independence disorientating, especially as the university offered no set curriculum or prescribed route of study. Direction came from handbooks such as Johnson's Guide for Studying Medicine at the University of Edinburgh, and from the explicit marketing of the professors themselves, who were not paid a salary by the university, but took their income directly from students, charging them 3 guineas apiece to attend their courses. The first 2 weeks of them were chaotic, as students considered a Rialto of possibilities, dropping in to sample the lectures of professors like Thomas Charles Hope, who would punctuate his chemistry classes with colourful phosphoric displays to maximise his income. John signed up for classes in anatomy, materia medica, and the institutions of medicine, which, according to Johnson's Guide, is to explain the principles on which the study of physics is founded. But the most important class John took was undoubtedly Practice of Medicine, a class that imparted all the indispensable skills of a 19th century physician, taught by Professor John Gregory, a popular eccentric who began each class by bowing and begging leave to wear his hat throughout the lecture. Thanks to a long career and students who had fanned out across the globe, Gregory had become one of the most influential medical educators alive by virtue of a class that focused almost exclusively on ridding the body of noxious substances in the briskest manner possible, by means of bloodletting, plunge baths, blisters, enemas, and vomiting. Out in the field, this anti-phlogistic regime, as it was known, produced remedies such as that used to treat a soldier named Walter Henry, who developed malaria during the Peninsular Campaign. His treatment began by having 36 leeches applied to his shaven head, after which he was carried into a yard and stood up while 25 buckets of cold water were poured on him from a third-floor window. It didn't work, so Henry devised his own plan to outrun his fever by drinking hot spiced wine and galloping across the Spanish plain. Under Gregory, John learned how to administer all the major classes of such remedies: purgatives, emetics, cathartics, tonics, stimulants, astringents, and sudorifics, and to apply its powerful pharmacy: opium for sedation, rhubarb, magnesia and senna for laxatives, Peruvian bark for fevers, and calomel for gripes and worms. He learned phlebotomy, bloodletting, the physician's stock in trade, drawing blood with a lancet from the arm, neck, or for women, the ankle, taking anywhere between 40 and 72 ounces, which is between 2.5 to 4.5 pints, or through the application of leeches to the temples, ears, and anus. Opportunities to practice these skills on sick people, however, were severely limited, and John's sole chance to walk the wards was confined to a single course of clinical lectures at the infirmary. where students formed unruly shoals and pushed, jostled, and ran and crowded around the beds quite regardless of the patient's condition. Certainly not much was learned at these goings round, recalled one eminent professor. They were mostly occupied with chattering and playing and making extra hospital arrangements. So I'm just going to compare this to Byron's education. In spite of its many shortcomings, medical education at the turn of the 19th century was at the leading edge of scientific innovation. As the fields of biology, psychology, comparative anatomy, botany and pharmacology succeeded physics as the key sites of discovery that challenged humanity's relationship to history, nature and God. In comparison with Byron's education at Cambridge, John's studies at Edinburgh were positively complex. Even though Byron claimed to have read 4,000 novels and countless volumes of law, history, biography and poetry by the time he was 19, his formal education did virtually nothing to improve him. Going up to Trinity College in the autumn of 1805, he entered what his friend Edward Noel Long called the headquarters of dullness, an institution embalmed in the past that required its students and faculty to wear gowns denoting their social rank, and where his own aristocratic status exempted him entirely from participation in lectures or exams. College improves in everything but learning, Byron had written to the son of his solicitor. Nobody here seems to look into an author, ancient or modern, if they can avoid it. Whereas John would dress before dawn, sit all day in lectures and walk home in the dark to spend his evening bent over a candle-lit text, of the 3 years of his enrolment at Cambridge, Byron spent less than 10 months in residence, and most of that he passed larking with Scroop, his friend, and Hobhouse, swimming in the weir above Grantchester or parading with Bruin, a pet bear he lodged in the stables of Ram Yard. The rest of the time was lost in country houses or dallying in London, where he was said to have learned more from his boxing lessons with gentleman John Jackson than he did from his college tutor. What Jackson couldn't teach him, he taught in the arms of the corps de ballet. I am buried in an abyss of sensuality, he told Hobhouse from his suite at Dorrance Hotel, where he'd retreated with some students of Drury Lane's dancing master. I'm given to harlots and live in a state of concubinage, he said. I have some thoughts of purchasing Degerville's pupils. They would fill a glorious harem. The fleshpots of Scotland were of a flintier hue. Medical students had a reputation for solemnity and discipline, which was reflected in their sober recreations, shopping for handmade trinkets sold through the palisades by prisoners at Edinburgh Castle, or taking rambles out to Craig Cook and the medieval chapel at Ross Lynn, mantled with ivy and in a picturesque state of ruin. In winter they went ice skating, and in summer stirred their boots with the gravel paths of the botanical gardens, whose 5 acres of plantings were strictly arranged according to the Linnaean system. There were some moments of intemperance, taverns commandeered for all-night games of billiards and visits to brothels, which were so numerous in Edinburgh that even a particularly pious student named Silas Neville visited 3 on his last day of term. Not with any bad intention, he said in his diary, but merely from curiosity. Fair enough. Okay, now I'm going to sort of skip forward to the time in Edinburgh and talk a little bit about the dynamic between John and Byron. So everybody now is in Geneva. Let me set the scene just a little briefly. Byron is on his way to Venice but has stopped for this Swiss sojourn. Claire Clairmont Shelley and Mary Shelley have followed via an independent route that is much quicker than Byron's, because Byron has promised never to set foot in France because he hates the Bourbons and what they did to Napoleon. So, you know, he will never set foot on French soil. So he circumnavigates and they follow the Rhine all the way down to Geneva, which is a very sort of long way to go. You go through the Low Countries and then sort of circle around France. Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley and Claire Clairmont go direct through France to Geneva, and so they get there first. However, Byron had had this very brief affair, slept with Claire Clairmont once or twice, and then told her he was going to Geneva, and she had kind of teased him and said, "I'll follow you," and he hadn't believed a word of it. So when she showed up, he was like horrified, thought, "I'd never see you again," but there she is, and she's there with her half-sister and with this crazy atheist visionary poet who they are in league with. And so Byron and Shelley start to get to know each other. They start sailing on the lake. Claire is kind of reduced to following everybody around, being sort of kept at a distance until Byron summons her to his bedroom on occasion, and then again pretends not to know her. So he has this very, very distant and cold and unfeeling relationship with her. She, in the meantime, is deeply in love with him, but he just keeps telling her to go away, and then she suddenly, later on in the summer, realizes she's pregnant. But just before that, this is the early days of friendship on the lake from John's perspective. Those early days of friendship were pleasant for John, and trips on the water became an evening ritual, passing among the lateen sails and rocky islands filled with nesting birds, to watch the sunset set and talk intently until the ladies' brains whizzed with giddiness about idealism, said John, significantly underestimating Claire and Mary's capacity for speculative conversation. Other times they sat in silence, the moon on its back, listening to the lap of water and the convivial chirrups of Swiss frogs. When Byron began to accompany them, the dynamic changed as he monopolised their outings with the brutal comedy of his worldliness and uncensored views on the literary and political figures of London. Others rose to the occasion. Mary recited the poems of Samuel Taylor Coleridge so well that a smitten John became a convert to his poetry, and Shelley amused them with the insults he had received on account of his atheism and the time his father had tried to disinherit him by having him committed to an asylum for the insane at Eton. John tried to contribute, but lacking Byron's authority or Shelley's unique perspective, his actions were tangled in uncertainty. He was the only paid employee among them, and though clearly apart from the servants, an uncomfortable ambiguity lingered about his caste, providing Byron with license to treat him as he wished, cracking jokes at his expense and watching him bristle as he nicknamed him Polidori, a sobriquet lifted straight from his Harrow school days, where any fair or mannered child was given a girl's name. To sour John's mood further, it was clear that Mary had an eye for Byron. When they all get together for the first time, John kind of fancies Mary Shelley, whom she found capricious, fascinating, and beautiful. On the rare occasions he managed to assert himself, his efforts emerged misshapen. One evening, while they were all out boating, he happened to strike violently on the kneecap with his oar, and the latter, as Mary told Tom Moore, Byron's biographer, without speaking, turned his face away to hide the pain. After a moment he said, "Be so kind, Polidori, another time, to take more care, for you hurt me very much." "I am glad of it," answered Polidori. "I am glad to see you can suffer pain." In a calm, suppressed tone, Lord Byron replied, "Let me advise you, Polidori, when you another time hurt anyone, not to express your satisfaction. People don't like to be told that those who give them pain are glad of it, and they cannot always command their anger. It was with some difficulty that I refrained from throwing you into the water, and but for Mrs. Shelley's presence, I would probably have done some such rash thing." For his own part, John was beginning to feel frustrated by boating and all that it offered. "Pains in my loins," he wrote in his diary, "and languor in my bones." And so the dynamic just gets worse and worse and worse until more of Byron's friends turn up in Switzerland and they convince him to get rid of this rather self-indulgent and petulant doctor who wants to be a writer himself and thinks he has literary talent, but finds that when he's in Byron's presence, all his self-worth is just kind of drained out of him by Byron's magnificence in the eyes of the world. So every time they go to a party together or something, Byron is welcomed with open arms and everyone is just sort of waiting on his every word. And Polidori hangs in the background and he says, "Byron's name alone was introduced and mine, like a star in the halo of the moon, was invisible." Or he'll say, "I was just merely a tassel on the purse of merit." And he starts to feel really slighted and overlooked, and he gets worse and worse and worse. And then eventually Byron and Shelley decide that they are going to take a tour of Lake Geneva and see all the sites associated with Jean-Jacques Rousseau's books, especially his book Julie. And so they don't want to invite Polidori because they know he'll be an incredible downer and he'll sort of ruin the party. And so when John cottons onto this, he runs upstairs, he mixes himself a potion of prussic acid, and he's just about to down it while telling everybody, "I'm going to kill myself, I'm so depressed." And Byron runs up and he actually has to sort of stroke his back and calm him down and stop him from committing suicide. And they're so frustrated by this, they just escape in the morning and they go off on their sailing expedition without Polidori. And Byron and Shelley take in the sights. They have this wonderful moment of sort of literary pilgrimage where they go around the lake and they visit all the sites associated with Rousseau's novel. And Shelley is having this wonderful sort of moment of transcendental revelry when he's kind of communing with the spirit of Rousseau, the great novelist of the Enlightenment. And he says to Byron, "Isn't this magnificent?" And Byron says, "Yes, thank God Polidori isn't here." So that was really the defining moment for him. So Byron eventually sacks him, and Polidori is forced to kind of walk home from Geneva into Italy, and he walks on foot across the Alps to Italy, where he has some relatives, some Italian relatives, and he spends some time in Italy, and eventually he sails back to Britain. And he's feeling extremely sorry for himself and extremely bruised by basically being rejected by this very famous person who he has this sort of resentful intimacy with. You know, he is deeply attracted to Byron, but deeply loathes him at the same time, and is envious of him, but also wants to be him quite clearly. And so he goes back to Britain. He has some misfired attempts to become a writer himself, and to be famous. Essentially, he thinks the cure to his happiness will be fame. So we'll pick that up there, and this will be the penultimate piece I'll read. So John was determined to be a writer still, and moreover to cure his unhappiness by attaining fame, but finding work proved difficult. Opportunities should have been plentiful, as never before had Britain enjoyed such a large and boisterous print culture, powered by the steam press and dominated by a central claque of magazines like the Edinburgh Review, whose pages sustained a debate on writers and their work that kept them constantly in the view of ordinary readers. As such, many of these magazines trafficked heavily in personalities, investing in the romantic ideology of the creative genius and its attendant fascination with the lives of individuals. In its purest form, this produced writing that was searching, confessional, and intimate, as in the personal essays of writers like William Hazlitt and Charles Lamb, whose work explored the varied moods of private life. In less exalted circumstances, it led to a prurient obsession with celebrities, where even the meanest insects, in Coleridge's words, are worshipped with a sort of Egyptian superstition. Magazines elevated their favourites and dropped them just as quickly. By changing the object of our admiration, wrote Hazlitt, we secretly persuade ourselves that there is no such thing as excellence. It is that which we hate above all things. This is the worm that gnaws us, that never dies. It made for a feuding, belligerent culture, with writers and editors marshalling into aesthetic and political factions that traded rascally gossip and personal attacks, giving many cause for concern. The ordinary business of life could not proceed if it became general, warned the Scotsman. We should have nothing but a perpetual round of cudgelling, duelling and stabbing if every weak, odd or even vicious private act of every individual were to be published, with all the circumstances of name, time and place for the general amusement. Within a month of his arrival back in London, John was writing to his sister Frances to complain of low spirits and ill health. I am still very miserable, he told her. I am so solitary and busy writing, and fag like a horse, uncertain whether I may not be wanting even of the power of fagging next day, not from illness, but by the caprice of a bookseller. With self-interest crouching in every corner and its churning spectacle serving only to affirm his friendlessness, London was to John a wasteland. Worse, he told Frances, than the deserts of Arabia. And so then he gets caught up in this really rather unfortunate incident. As you know, and I've rather sort of elided this, but during the course of that summer in Geneva, Frankenstein was conceived and written by Mary Shelley, and it comes out, and even though it's become, you know, a very powerful story within popular culture, it was a slow burner. It didn't come out to great acclaim, but it was out there and it was noticed, and it was considered to be, of significant interest that it was dramatized in the theatre, and there were various different editions in circulation. Polidori was also there at that story and writing competition and actually wrote a story, but at the time he didn't do anything with it. And then somehow the manuscript finds its way into the hands of an unscrupulous publisher called Coburn, who publishes it in his new monthly magazine. It's a story called The Vampyre, right? And it really is the very first sort of fully realized vampire story in English literature, and it has the figure of a vampire as that kind of loose and debonair foreigner, you know, very much a proto-Dracula. Prior to that, vampires in literature had been these kind of feral, hairy beasts that were caked with mud and which ran around with sort of big claws in the Greek countryside. And so Polidori took this concept and he sort of translated it into the aristocratic culture of England at the time, as if to suggest that the aristocrats themselves were kind of predatory and, you know, sucked the life out of you, like perhaps the aristocrat Lord Byron had sucked the life out of him, right? Anyway, he writes this manuscript, but Cockburn publishes it as The Vampire, a Tale by Lord Byron, right? And says that Byron had written it during that summer of 1816. And so it becomes wildly popular. It sells out because of the vagaries of copyright law at that time. If you copyrighted something, or rather, if you published something in a book, you then owned the copyright. So he made sure that he published sort of bound folio editions of this so that it would go out there and he would get all the money. And Polidori sort of turns around and says, well, hang on, I actually wrote that. It's not Lord Byron at all. And then everybody accuses Polidori of trying to sort of, you know, exactly borrow Lord Byron's fame for his own ends. And so he gets accused of plagiarism, he gets accused of being a fraud, of trying to insert himself and get this kind of reflected glory from Byron. And he just cannot remedy the situation. He just does not have the sufficient sort of purchase within culture or know the right people to actually get the true story out there. And so he becomes very, very depressed, and his name has been maligned. He gives up writing and he decides he wants to return to the church. And so he writes to the headmaster of Ampleforth School, the Catholic school he'd gone to as a boy, and says, I want to become a monk. And the headmaster says, unfortunately, we can't take you due to some publications with which you've been associated, and you know, which we don't think is appropriate for the order. So that's off. So then he goes and studies law. But as a Catholic, he's the only kind of law that he's allowed to study is conveyancing, the transference of property from one person to another, and it's pretty boring. He doesn't really like conveyancing very much. And because at this time he is, you know, he's got this infamy following him, he stops using the name Polidori and actually signs up for law school under his mother's maiden name, which is Pierce. So he almost kind of disavows his own name. So this goes on for a while. His spirits get worse and worse and worse and worse. And then eventually he sort of drops off the map for a while and then reappears in Brighton, which is a seaside town in the south of England, which is kind of was known in the 18th century as very much being a resort. So in Brighton, we're in 1821 by now, so 5 years after the summer in Geneva. In Brighton, John behaved out of character, which is to say, exactly like most young men of his age, drinking and gaming. He was a rather kind of uptight young man prior to this. Who he caroused with is unknown, although given that 6 months earlier he told Francis that he had no friends in London at all, they may have been new acquaintances made at the Inns of Court, which are the law schools. Certainly they were a different group from the kind of those he had associated with before, as he gambled heavily and lost heavily too. Having incurred a debt of honour, which he had no present means of paying off, he left the coast and returned to London. Be sure that no happiness can be grounded upon vice or misconduct, his father had once written to him when he was at school. But to lose money on the gaming tables was almost a scripted ruin. The losses affected John badly, and he was in poor spirits when he reappeared at his father's house in London on the 20th of August 1821 after 3 weeks away. The house was empty as the rest of the family were away at their country cottage in Holme Green, save for his godfather, John D'Agostini. It was a while before anyone noticed that John was behaving strangely. The maid, Charlotte Reed, thought he looked unwell and oddly agitated as he complained of pains in his side and spoke in short sentences, abutting on incoherence, behaviour that continued when D'Agostini invited him up to his apartment to dine with one of his friends. John looked haggard throughout the meal, ate little and spoke, according to his godfather, in a very harsh way, like one of deranged mind, causing particular consternation when, in the course of a discussion about the future state of Britain, John told De Agostini that I should see more than him, meaning his godfather will see more of the future than he will. Getting up to leave, he shook the hand of his godfather's friend so violently that the man was forced to kneel on the ground. That evening, John instructed Charlotte to leave a glass tumbler in his room and told her not to wake him the next morning. A little later, he came back to sit with De Agostini but refused to utter a word. At 25 years old, John Polidori had achieved more than most men 3 times his age. His novels were as promising as they were unique, although underrated, and his intellectual gifts could have placed him in the higher reaches of any profession. Although Byron liked to joke about John's skill as a physician, he knew his trade, and just weeks before he'd left Brighton had nursed his beloved sister Frances back to health from a severe case of scarlet fever. Yet a worm gnawed at his inners, and with a temperament unsuited to fellowship and the conviction that his life had been a failure, his hopes gave over to despair. At noon the next day, the 24th of August, Charlotte Reed went to open his blinds and found him lying dressed on his bed with a tumbler of liquid on the chair beside him. He was breathing but unconscious. Reed called up to De Agostini, who immediately sent her out to Golden Square to fetch a doctor. She returned with Thomas Copeland, who tried to make him vomit. But this time, a second doctor, by this time, William Davis had arrived from nearby Poland Street. But even with both men attending, their efforts were in vain. 3 hours later, Gaetano returned from his cottage in the country to the news that his eldest son was dead. An inquest was convened in the sitting room, presided over by John Gell and a jury of 24 neighbours, 13 of them from adjoining houses. Everyone who knew John suspected that he'd killed himself, most probably with the same bitter almond-scented solution of prussic acid he had mixed for himself at the Villa Diodati in Geneva. Prussic acid occurs in many things, including laurel leaves, the garland of the poets, as Shelley had once discovered, having made himself sick after reading that chewing them stimulated poetic creativity. Its poison is swift, inducing a chemical asphyxiation that convulses the body and flushes the face bright pink. So for John to have been conscious when Copeland arrived sometime before 1 o'clock, according to the evidence he gave the jury, he must have taken an imperfect dose only moments before the maid found him. Yet no trace was discovered of it in his room, a fact Copeland confirmed by taking a sip from the bedside tumbler to find it contained only water. In the absence of any evidence, the coroner displayed a charitable unwillingness to declare the death suicide and thus deny a respected member of the community the chance to bury his son in sanctified ground. A verdict was returned by the end of the day, departed his life in a natural way by the visitation of God. It was the sole notice of John's passing to be printed in the paper. "Poor Polidori," said Byron when he heard the news. "It seems that disappointment was the cause of this rash act. He had entertained too sanguine hopes of literary fame." Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any. That's only really half the book because the story of Claire Clairmont is given equal weight. But we have treats, we have wine. If you'd like to help yourself and mingle, I'd be happy to answer questions in a more social format. So thank you very much.